Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's media conference hosted by the C20, the Australian Civil Society Dialogue to the G20. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. My name's Joanne Yates. I'm the Australian C20 Sherpa. For those of you who don't know, the C20 is a group of domestic and international non-government organisations and individuals who represent social services, environment, women, Indigenous, multicultural and human rights organisations. We've engaged fully with the G20 processes throughout the year. And we've made 18 interrelated recommendations across the areas of inclusive growth and employment, infrastructure, climate change and resource sustainability, and governance, including, importantly, international taxation reform and transparency. We think that the G20 must use its leadership to address these key and pressing concerns. The C20 will be looking at the communique for commitments to real and concrete action across all of these areas. We think it must contain more than simply platitudes. Making our case for that reform is our chair, Tim Costello. We also have with us today Greg Thompson from Transparency International, who's also been the co-chair of our governance working group, Cassandra Goldie, deputy chair and lead on our infrastructure discussions, Sally Sinclair, who's led our Inclusive Growth and Employment Working Group, and trying to get his way through traffic is Dermot O'Gorman, who's taken up the challenge of making sure that climate change is a standalone agenda item on the G20's deliberations this weekend. So without further ado, I might ask Tim to make a short statement about our body of work, followed by his colleagues, after which we'll open the floor for questions. There will be some roving mics, so if you indicate your intention to ask a question, we'll get a microphone to you. Thanks, Tim.
Well, thank you for being here, and C20 is a newer engagement group. As one of the engagement groups for the G20, we started having really good access to the G20 under President Putin's leadership. We had an hour and a half with him in his Dasher, and we understand he's on his way here, as his ships are on his way here, it seems. So we are very pleased that C20 is now embedded, because it's essentially about people. And the high financial and economic architecture, which is incomprehensible to most people in G20 nations, dramatically affects their lives, or the non-decisions, if we don't get outcomes, affects their lives also. So the fact that business has always been a significant player at the G20, and we know with governments being broke, they're essentially saying to business, well, tell us what red tape you want us to cut and deregulation you need so that we can get you investing. Labour has always been a bookend as part of the G20, and a very important focus on quality jobs, apprenticeships, if we're going to focus on growth. But civil society is about people, and our theme is fairness. It's saying if there is growth, then it should, if it's 2% above trend growth, the real acid test is, does it flow to the bottom 20% of households in each G20 nation? And our research and paper says that if it did, that would be about 930 Australian dollars, over 800 US dollars, to the bottom 20% of households over the next 4 years. That would lift the incomes of 1 billion people in absolute poverty. When you're trying to survive on $1.25 a day, an $800 US increase is literally life-saving. So it's about fairness for them. Will the growth plans include them? Will it include the 650 million young people who are unemployed that Sally will talk about? Will it be fair to them? Will it be fair to the 168 million children in bonded labour, in modern-day slavery, who the market says, well, them working for nothing, though it destroys their lives, lowers prices and consumer goods, growth at the cost of destroying their lives. Will it be fair to them? Certainly we have focused on the fairness to those who pay tax in G20 countries, and say, why do tax havens even exist? Civil society really has lost its patience. We won't tolerate excuses that when we're paying tax, there are rich multinationals and rich individuals who are avoiding it. And the Lux leaks, as they're called, out of Luxembourg, showed many companies who claimed they were pure, actually involved in massive tax avoidance. So the dirty little secret is out. And the impatience of civil society that this G20 step up and deal with things called beneficial ownership, where the economic activity is separated from the legal ownership, which is in a tax haven or a low taxing country. That's a question of fairness. And I might say it was civil society in London, 2009, demonstrating on the streets that really put the pressure on here. Tax and tax havens had been on the G20 agenda before, but until civil society demonstrated and said, why is Google, Apple, Starbucks not paying tax? It was really an issue that just said, oh, it's a few poor countries that we're ripping off, not really a big issue for the rich countries. Suddenly, rich countries said, we're losing out too. Ordinary people are demonstrating, and we've seen energy in this whole agenda. So this G20 will be measured by fairness there. Finally, it will be measured particularly by fairness in the climate change agenda. Civil society said, how can you even discuss energy efficiency without discussing climate change? The two are fundamentally linked. And the game changer in the last couple of days with the deal between China and the US, we believe raises inevitably the question of fairness to future generations. Are these growth plans, country by country submitted plans, still dependent on dirty energy, which threatens the future generations? These growth plans unfair to particularly the poor, the developing world, who are already impacted massively by climate change? They're on the worst land, in the most perilous, fragile ecologies and environments, where sea surges and rains, when they come as monsoons, and when drought comes, they're longer, already impacting their lives. Will this G20, when it addresses climate change, and it's not yet on the agenda, and we're calling for it to be on the agenda, actually be fair to them? So fairness for people is really the C20 agenda. And look, I can modestly claim that I think we've started to have an influence on this agenda since we've been there. Inclusive growth, which is about fairness, was in the St. Petersburg Declaration. It needs to be in this declaration. Inclusive is really about fairness. If the growth actually just flows into profits, we hear a lot of assumptions that growth means jobs. It doesn't necessarily. Growth can mean profits. You don't hear that word used too often, but that's what it can mean, and it flows to the top 1% who are already rich. If it's that sort of 2% growth, then the G20 has failed the fairness test, and civil society will be saying that you have failed. But with the leaders here, this is a ripe opportunity in a world apparently falling apart when we think of the challenges. I might just add Ebola, profound government and market failure. Why wasn't there research into Ebola? Because we said it only breaks out in Africa and it's patchy, and they don't have a big market because they're poor. That's why we don't have a vaccine. That's why we don't have a treatment, because it didn't affect us. It's a profound government market failure that suddenly we said, oh, Ebola's reaching us, and we're scrambling. The G20 must actually have fairness for people who are the poorest in all G20 household countries, and that's our test. I'll throw back to Joanne.
Thank you very much, Tim. I now invite Sally Sinclair to brief you on our Inclusive Growth and Employment platform. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanne. It's good to be here with you this afternoon and to talk about the things that are important to civil society. I've had the great honour of actually being the coordinator of the dialogue around inclusive growth and employment across the global platform, and clearly this is an area which, as Tim's very eloquently outlined, is really fundamental. Australia must use this presidency to deliver concrete action to address global inequality. We have leaders from around the globe who are articulating the significant impacts of the rise in inequality, and this is now the time to do something about it. So to do that, we've got to have a growth agenda which is inclusive, as Tim has said, and is sustainable. It must improve commensurately the income levels of the bottom 20% of the populations in each of its member nations. We want to see greater equity, both within and between nations. We believe that the inclusion of civil society in the dialogue that we've been engaging with the G20 has actually contributed to the G20's legitimacy, and also we are firmly of the view that it enhances its accountability and as such is a vital part of the ongoing dialogue around within the G20. But the growth plans that the G20 nations deliver will ultimately be judged, as Tim has said, on fairness. So specifically when it comes to employment, which is certainly an area which people have been very exercised about in the dialogue and the various crowdsourcing platforms that we've actually been undertaking for the last 18 months. We know that post the GFC that essentially we had growth, but we didn't actually have growth in jobs. So what we want to make sure is that we have growth which is jobs rich. And in that jobs rich growth is inclusive. And they've got to be quality jobs with social and legal protections. We've got significant issues with a number of member nations with developing economies where there's a massive informal economy. And as such, people do not have the necessary social and legal protections. This is a fundamental challenge for the G20. The country growth strategies must articulate plans and targets. And in particular, youth and women need to be a priority focus. We understand that, that the countries have, in principle, agreed to a target on women's participation to close the gap by 25% by 2025. Now, that's a very significant start and it's a good thing. Ideally, we'd like to see it to be completely closed, and we know that that one measure alone would actually achieve the 2% growth target. But nevertheless, as we say, it's a good start. Of course, equal pay is a critical part of improving gender equality as well, and this is something that we believe must be addressed. As Tim's also outlined, there's 600 million young people across the globe who are not in education, training or employment. 600 million. It's neither desirable nor economically sustainable. The scourge of the official rates of unemployment have today been communicated by the OECD. We're now over 15% youth unemployment across the OECD. And in some countries, of those that are represented here in the G20, we have 1 in 2 young people who are unemployed. That's a scourge. And so what we can't understand and what we'd like the G20 to make some determinations about in its deliberations over the next 2 days is why don't we have targets on addressing youth unemployment? We have statements, but we don't have any targets. And without actually putting a measure on it, we don't quite know when we get there, how we're going to get there. So I think this is something that we'd really like to see strong, decisive action and leadership on from the G20. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks very much, Sally. I'd now like to invite Greg Thompson to address the issues of corruption and transparency. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks very much, Joanne, and it's good to be here today and to be able to represent those of us who worked with me on the governance agenda of the C20 Steering Committee. Those people, during this time, we've sought to address issues that are fundamental to ensuring the inclusive growth and fairness agenda that we articulate and stand behind again today. Those risks of corruption, the lack of financial and tax transparency are issues that we've been addressing through the year. And we're looking forward to, in the communique, to bringing that, for the leaders to bring to a head those commitments that have been articulated and worked through with the Anti-Corruption Working Group. We're looking to the announcement of a commitment to an action plan of the Anti-Corruption Working Group, which has been developed over these past 12 months, over the next 2 years, in which member governments of the G20 will fulfil the commitments that have been made and are identified as key areas to take further the steps that need to be taken to address the risks of corruption, including issues around whistleblower protection, the need to ensure greater transparency around public procurement processes, the assurance of further progress within the OECD and the G20 itself on prevention of foreign bribery and the prosecution of foreign bribery, and a further step in terms of transparency in the extractive industries. These are all important elements to an action plan that we hope will be affirmed by the leaders in their communique on Sunday, but also published as a public record and commitment by the G20 countries to act over the next 2 years. And we'll be closely monitoring the progress that is made against that action plan. An important element within that action plan will be a statement towards a commitment of principles on beneficial ownership of companies in order to remove companies' secrecy. And we see that in the next 2 years, going beyond those principles, a public register of beneficial ownership being established by each of the G20 countries is an important mark of progress towards ending the flight of money by corrupt leaders around the world and the prevention of tax evasion by too many people globally. These are shared commitments on both the anti-corruption and the tax transparency agenda. And in that tax transparency agenda, we note the work that has been done over the last 12 months by the OECD and the G20 together in progressing towards the fulfilment of an action plan on base erosion and profit shifting, and a commitment to country-by-country reporting. We believe that they should take further the steps beyond simply agreeing to country-by-country reporting to ensure that those reports are made public so that we can hold governments to account, that citizens can be aware of how their money is being used and how that money can be used to ensure the promotion of inclusive growth, and together with greater transparency around by the automatic exchange of information on tax. These are all elements, and we're looking forward to these elements being clearly stated by the leaders, committed to by the leaders, and fulfilled as they work towards fulfilling the commitments they make on Sunday.
Thanks so much, Greg. A quick throw to Dermot O'Gorman to address the highlights for our climate change agenda. Thanks.
Climate change is on my agenda. It's on the agenda of the C20. It's on the agenda of most of the leaders of the G20 countries visiting Brisbane this weekend. It's on the agenda of small island developing states, of African countries, of Latin American countries, and of Southeast Asian and South Asian countries. And it's on the agenda of hundreds of millions of people around the world, both in rich and poor countries. It's been my privilege to chair or be the co-chair of the Climate and Sustainability Group under the C20 over the last year. And the committee has been very consistent in its approach to climate change. In all our consultations, both in Australia and around the world, the C20 has seen climate change as an issue of equity, of fairness, and about ensuring that we do provide and secure the jobs, the security, the livelihoods for both the millions of and hundreds of millions of poor people around the world, but also for developing and developed countries alike. In our opinion, climate change is an economic issue. If we have more than 2 degrees warming, and we're well on track to surpass 2 degrees warming by all scientific predictions, we could wipe as much as 2% of global GDP growth. But, and this is an important but, by ending handouts to fossil fuel subsidies, to oil, gas and coal interests, we could save around $2 trillion a year, which equates to around 2% of global economic growth. That would help to reduce CO2 emissions by around 13%. And that has been something that the C20 has been consistently calling on, to ensure that we transition both G20 countries, but also least developed countries, to ensure that we're able to deal with the challenges of climate change, but also, as the C20 sees, the opportunity that a clean economy provides. This week, the announcement by China and US is a game changer. In my previous role, I was the CEO of WWF in China for 5 years. Over that period, I saw the Chinese systematically put in energy efficiency targets, which were incredibly ambitious, discuss domestic targets for solar, for wind, and roll out enormous investments into those, both for their domestic consumption, but also for export trade. The discussions over the last 4 years around coal have been going on to look at when they will peak on coal, and you will have seen the announcement over the last few months on that. The announcement today to cap emissions at 2030 is a long way earlier than everybody else had predicted. If you think about that, it means that China will, and I'm reliably informed from colleagues in China, that will probably peak before 2030. The impacts that will have in terms of driving towards a clean economy, of the Chinese ability to produce renewable technologies, battery technologies at a cheaper price, will have a dramatic disruptive effect across the whole economy, which will be able to benefit both rich and poor countries alike. So it is a game changer. The G20 countries have a special role to play in tackling climate change, because together they account for more than 80% of global emissions through economic activity. So simply put, climate change needs to be a formal part of the G20 agenda here in Brisbane this weekend. I'd like to add my congratulations to both the federal and Queensland governments, particularly the bureaucrats and staff who have worked tirelessly over the last few months to bring, or the last few years, to bring the G20 to Brisbane. It's been well organised, it's been well planned, and I think as Australians we're very proud to have the world come here to Brisbane and to be able to showcase this beautiful city and this beautiful country. But I think that it is a chance. We have this one opportunity between now and Paris for the leaders to really sort out the details as what would make a fair and equitable deal in Paris happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Dermot. And as we're about to enter into a heat wave, we're just reminded of the impacts of extreme weather events and climate change is confirmed as an important part of the agenda, we hope. Cass.
Thank you, Joanne. So I also want to extend to you a very warm welcome as the Deputy Chair of the C20 and to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we are all gathering. You're all gathering from around the globe, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and you will be aware and you will have the opportunity to meet many of the Aboriginal leaders, we hope, over the next couple of days. I think the leadership of Indigenous peoples around the globe is very inspiring to civil society generally and should be inspiring to us all. We've been very focused. My specific work as part of the C20 has been on this very important agenda about infrastructure investment. We absolutely agree that we do need to be investing in the right kind of capabilities for countries, for local communities, to drive the right kind of economic development, to get the social, economic and environmental outcomes that we all aspire to. We applaud the Australian Government for having a strong agenda on infrastructure investment. We think it's right. We do congratulate the Australian Government for the leadership of proposing the Global Infrastructure Hub. But we all know that history is littered with devastation from big mistakes made by infrastructure investment. Far too many local communities have been devastated. Far too many environments have been absolutely transformed. Far too many infrastructure projects have really only led to profits for a few, to high levels of corruption with very little impact on the real economy and the opening up of wonderful job opportunities for local communities and for stimulating the real economy. That is why we say that it is time. Civil society has done its job. It has been out there for decades criticising what has happened in the past around infrastructure development, and it will continue to do that. But this is an opportunity, we believe, for us to bring the shared interests into the room over the planning and development for infrastructure into the future. That is why, for us, we want to see the G20 leaders, firstly, commit to a very clear triple bottom line planning framework for infrastructure development and investment, making sure that there is clear monitoring and evaluation, clear targets and expectations that are transparent around the economic, social and environmental gains that will be achieved. Equally important will be to make sure that there is clear, transparent safeguards in place to prevent economic, social and environmental devastation. And finally, we do believe that it is wrong for us to always presume that infrastructure planning and investment will be done purely by a public-private partnership. We want to see value for money. How these infrastructure projects are designed may involve public investment, private investment, and a role for civil society as well. We believe that if we can have good, strong governance over infrastructure investment, where civil society organisations who have high-level skills are around the tables for the pipeline identification, for the planning, for the standards, for the social protections, for the regulation that needs to be put in place, then we can prevent the worst of what we've seen in the past, and we can really all get behind this very important agenda. I do want to conclude before we open up the floor for questions with some sincere thanks. Civil society wants to thank His Holiness Pope Francis for his important intervention in the last few days. The correspondence that he has sent on behalf of one of the great faiths of the world to say to G20 leaders, you have an ethical responsibility to make sure that your focus on economic policy has as its core the obligation to lift the living standards of people who are the poorest is absolutely right. And he has also urged G20 leaders to take the climate change agenda seriously. I also want to, on behalf of my colleagues, acknowledge the intervention by the International President of national human rights institutions around the globe, who in just the last 2 days have also issued an open call to G20 leaders to make sure that economic and social rights are at the heart of this work. That is what this agenda is about. Growth is not there for an end in itself. It is there to make sure that around the globe, communities, there are 2.5 million people in Australia right now who are living below the poverty line. 2.5 million people in Australia are watching. 1.9 billion people around the globe are watching, because we know that the decisions over the next 2 days should matter to them, that we have a shared responsibility. So we come to the table today with optimism, but also with a serious expectation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'll open up for questions, please. At the front here. Microphone. Thanks.
Hello. I'm Clovis Rossi from the Brazilian daily Folha de São Paulo. You certainly are aware of the final draft of the G20's final declaration, I suppose. Does it cover all the needs that you, Mr. Costello, mentioned about fairness? Can you say that fairness is contained in this draft? Probably is almost the final declaration itself.
Yeah, we don't know the final draft. Funnily enough, no one's leaked it to us. But some earlier drafts have certainly shifted from what was dropping the word inclusive to at least reappearing, as we understand it. We think there's been a contest around this because inclusive and the word inequality is seen by some as too left-wing, too bleeding heart, and this is an economic focus forum. But we think we've had an impact in seeing that word inclusive reappear in some of the earlier drafts. Obviously, we'll see what references are made to climate change because, as we've said many times, the submitted country-by-country policies, I think there's over 1,000 of them since St Petersburg, to show that there are new pathways to growth, haven't necessarily been framed with the news of this climate change agreement between China and America. And if those country-by-country action plans had thrown up things that are fossil fuel growth plans, we would say this is now the moment to actually review them. If they've got a pare back from the growth plans and say, we can see, as America and China have done, you can do growth which is moving to non-fossil fuel growth. Now, I know that might include nuclear, it might include a range of other measures, but we think now the final draft needs to take on board the reality of this game changer, the deal between America and China and what growth plans have been submitted. The final thing I'd say is we know there's a whole lot of pressure just to produce a 2-page communique. At the end of the day, whatever the communique says, and we'll probably tick that there's some words in there that are important, what we really need to know is the country-by-country plans, and are they passing the sustainable test, the test of benefiting the bottom 20% of households in each G20 country. We happen to know that Australia has submitted cutting the unemployment benefit for people under 30 for 6 months. Now, from an austerity point of view, people say in Australia, well, this will get young people with the incentive to really get off their backsides and get out and find a job. We think that will increase inequality. There are only one job for every 3 young people applying, and to cut them off the dole, the unemployment benefit will increase inequity here. We say that shouldn't be read in as a growth plan. It doesn't pass the fairness test, the inequity test. So knowing what countries have got in their actual plans is the real devil in the detail, whatever the fine declaratory principles in 2 pages say.
I would also add to that, we recognise that until the communique is released, it is a draft. And we understand, we would expect that there is still time to push to make sure that if there is one word that might be in or might be out, and if that word is inclusive, we certainly encourage everybody to do what you can to push to make sure that word, if it's currently out, gets back in. But what we don't accept is that the process right now we seem to have is that the country level plans are also not released for public dialogue prior to presentation at the G20 leaders meeting. In the Australian context, for example, we've only had essentially a leak about what the government is bringing to the G20 leaders for its national growth plan. And we believe it's absolutely crucial that the policies that countries commit to for inclusive, sustainable growth are developed out of trust relationships with the business community, with civil society and with labour organisations. That is how good, sustainable, durable policy is developed, and that is how you can have the highest confidence that it can be implemented back at the country level. We have had far too many experiences where governments go behind closed doors, they do a black box, they come up with a policy, they announce it, and the community at large says that won't work. That is what we've said about the proposal to cut off youth unemployment in the Australian context for 6 months of every year. Business community and civil society have already said we don't believe that will work in opening up job opportunities and pursuing inclusive growth. So we urge leaders to recognise that with the challenges that the political leaders have right now, the trust deficit that is there, what you need to do is bring us in, work with us on good, decent country-level plans, and we certainly hope to see that that will be the process throughout the course of the next presidency. Thank you.
Question down here, thanks.
Hi, good afternoon. Rocio Otoya from Agencia F, Spain's international news agency. I've got 2 questions. The first one is that Oxfam had said that since Australia took the presidency of the G20, $17 trillion has been produced in wealth in the G20 countries, but more than a third went to 1% of the population, the richest one. So, quoting Mr. Abbott, is this a talk fest already, this G20? And my second question is, I know perhaps I'm talking just about a particular case, which is Mexico, the death of the 43 students in Iguala. Mexico has been praised this year by Mr. Hockey for its reforms, but Mr. Enrique Peña Nieto, who had just landed today, is criticized internationally by this case of the Iguala student. Is the civil C20 organization has any comments about this particular case, or will address this case to the Mexican president?
Let me take the first one and then throw it open. Oxfam is a member of the C20 and serves on the committee, and we know that 85 individuals have wealth equal to 3.5 billion poor people in our world. We all know in most countries the growing gap between rich and poor, the inequality is blowing out, which is why we have said the acid test is whether it benefits the bottom 20% of households in G20 countries. We really do have a contest around this notion of inequality, and we need to be upfront. The real choices at the G20 and countries line up on either side is austerity versus stimulus. Everyone agrees that if you can get growth, it solves the revenues of governments because taxes increase and hopefully there will be better times. But the divide over austerity and stimulation is really a big one. We say there are billions in tax havens and evaded tax and avoided tax that should be closed up. That could be part of a stimulus package for a start. Let's start there. Secondly, on equality, some on the austerity side say, well, everyone starts at the same starting line. As long as everyone's at that line, some are smarter, some are faster, some are in economies which run better, govern better, so they're going to be richer. Inequality doesn't matter. C20 says it's a nonsense to say we're all at the same starting line. Particularly the poorest 20% of households are way behind that starting line, which is why growth plans have to be actually investing money in health, in education, in dealing with child labour and stimulating that, not simply in austerity that cuts social safety nets and insurance. So that contest around equality is very, very clear, and C20 says the blowing out of that inequality must be addressed, or it will just be a talk fest.
And I must say, we do have a few others that agree with us, including the IMF and the OECD, that inequality is a problem, and it's a problem for economic growth as well as for social and environmental protections.
Next question, please.
Hello. There was a Mexico question.
Oh, beg your pardon.
Joe Hockey praising Mexico. Who wants to have a go at that? Greg?
No,
I'm not sure that any of us are familiar enough to
apologise.
answer, but we'll take it
that?
afterwards with you.
Thank
take
you.
it up
Take
with
it
you. That'd be
back and
great.
come back to you,
Come back
yeah.
to you. Thanks.
Hello, Daniel Hurst here from The Guardian. I just wanted to get beyond the language of inclusive growth and into a bit more specifics. Can you sort of outline what particular actions governments can take, including the Australian government, to actually achieve that inclusive growth? So just a bit more by way of concrete actions beyond the language. Is it through the taxation system? What sorts of steps do you want to see?
Thanks, Cass. Perhaps you.
So if we use the Australian example, and if you draw on the frameworks that have been put out by the OECD on what is required, you clearly need an adequate safety net. So that is why we've got this growing consensus in the Australian context that we have major gaps in the social protection system, including the unemployment payment, and that there needs to be some investment there to make sure that people have at least a basic, adequate standard of living when you are not able, for a range of reasons, to either find work or be in paid work. Secondly, you need to have proper investment to stimulate jobs growth. That's why, for example, with the infrastructure agenda, we cannot just assume that that will flow directly out into jobs growth. That's why you need to have active strategies to make sure that you've got a proper flow through into equitable job outcomes. You need to be investing in education and training. Quite clearly, in the Australian context, we are nowhere near behind the eight ball as some of our other countries, but clearly you would need to have proper good investment in education, particularly targeted to people who are more disadvantaged. And then on the other side of it, of course, you need to have a sustainable tax base. And if there was ever any idea that there were some countries who were doing really well on that front, and that we had sort of a handful of countries where corruption was high and people weren't paying their fair share, as Tim has said, clearly this is a very significant global major challenge for us. And the G20 leaders clearly are exactly the right place to make sure that we are getting the kind of global cooperation required. It's not only, though, about the base erosion and profit shifting. I think we, for example, in the Australian context, need to make sure that we have the institutional arrangements to be pursuing tax evasion and tax avoidance, rather than going for smaller and smaller government, loss of more jobs out of, for example, the tax office, to make sure that we've got the institutional capability for the collection of a fair share of tax, and to make sure that we're shutting down on tax loopholes. This is an experience in Australia as it is around the globe.
Look, I just wanted to add also that if you look across the OECD over the last year, a lot of the work that they've looked at in relation to where the jobs are coming from, where they're being created, is that their estimates are that 75% of jobs are actually being created through entrepreneurship and innovation. So certainly in the Australian context, we would see, in addition to the areas that Cass has outlined, you need to really strengthen the investment in a range of active labour market programs, but in particular a focus on self-employment and entrepreneurship, which is may surprise you, is actually quite frequently those who are quite disadvantaged in the labour market. The OECD's research has shown actually do very well in that area, and we think that that could be a significant area of opportunity for the Australian government should they strengthen their investment in that area to achieve their 1 million jobs growth target over the next 5 years and 2 million over the next 10.
I might add that as to the Australian submissions, with women's participation, it's our Prime Minister and Government's paid parental leave, PPL, that they're submitting. We'll increase that. I would say the Labor ministers in their communique noted, and Senator Erica Betts from Australia chairs that, noted that there's $10 to $15 trillion spent by G20 governments in supply chain procurement. And they said that lever should be used to actually remove child labour, and governments can actually start by going, we aren't going to give any contracts to any companies, even our own home ground countries, if they're using child labour. So we'll hopefully be seeing something, if not in the communique, in the action plans, the Labor action plans on that.
The gentleman at the front row there.
Thank you. My question is for, I'm Hari Baskara from Kompas, Indonesia. For Mr. Greg Thompson, Indonesia has urged Asian countries in Myanmar 2 days ago to work together on fighting corruption and establishing transparency governments across ASEAN. Would that be possible with the G20, which has no treaty, no binding agreement? Thank you.
Sorry, I missed the last part.
Oh yeah, G20 doesn't have treaty, doesn't have legal binding, doesn't have secretariat,
Can't
whatever.
enforce, G20 can't enforce anything it
Yeah,
comes up with.
thank you.
No, that's very true, but within the G20 there are opportunities for close collaboration of countries beyond the OECD, where there is a commitment to the signatory countries of the OECD Convention on Foreign Bribery. The OECD has committed to working with the G20 countries to try to broaden that commitment to implementation and enforcement of foreign bribery and to create a standard. The other opportunity I think that Australia is missing out on, where Indonesia has provided leadership in the region, and that is the commitment to the Open Government Partnership as a framework for openness in the region. The Australian government indicated its commitment to that Open Government Partnership, but we're still waiting for the Australian government to actually complete an action plan which will fulfil that commitment. So this is one other area where international collaboration between countries, being open with one another and making commitments within this, where a voluntary framework could really strengthen that mutual accountability, I think.
I think we have time for one more. Thank you.
Matt Siegel from the Reuters news agency. There have been some reports that China has rejected the draft principles on beneficial ownership. There's a report out yesterday from source to Transparency International, actually. So firstly, is that correct, that China has rejected the draft principles on beneficial ownership? And of course, would it be possible to reach any meaningful resolution without China?
I think there has been some indication that there's some continuing negotiation about what will be in the final communique. And I was talking to someone this morning who's actually engaged in those discussions from the Australian government, indicating some optimism that those principles will still be committed to, and that the leaders will sign off on those principles, not going as far as the public registers of beneficial ownership, but at least a commitment to the principles that provide a basis for further discussion within the anti-corruption working group over the next 2 years to take the next step of achieving public registers of beneficial ownership. So we still remain hopeful and optimistic that this will be the case.
Second row there, thank you.
Hi, I have a question to Mr. O'Gorman. I'm the China correspondent of DPA, German press agency, so I would like to challenge you a little bit on your game changer assessment, which sounds very optimistic to me. China is using a lot of coal, 2/3 of coal, and even if they push renewables, which we all know they are doing a great job there, but it won't change that they need 2/3 of their energy coming from coal. So where do you really, and we all along knew that they would peak in 2030. So even if they don't do anything, they would peak then. I mean, in summer we had government officials saying it will be 2030. So where do you see the progress?
Good. Okay. Well, look, I think that the G20 leaders need to, before they go to Paris next December, to commit in the first quarter to really put those targets on the table. So we've seen now the Europeans do that, the China and the US do that in recent days. That are three of the biggest emitters and economies, and we really need to see the rest of the G20 leaders come forward in that first quarter with commitments on that. I think that's critically important. There will be a lot of debate as to how China and the US will tackle this issue, both the issues you raise in China, but also how President Obama will deal with the new Senate and the US Congress. What I think is important is this signals, I think for the first time, a commitment by the two biggest economies to to strong targets going forward over the post-2020. And that's the first time that we've seen that. So I think the conversation in how China does that, you will know that there is a lot of conversation about the role of coal, the health costs, the cost to poor people in China, the cost to the middle class in China is growing. And I think that's part of why China will invest enormously in the transition. That transition will include a whole lot of new technologies that will be rolled out in the next few years. And the US is one of the biggest investors, driving enormous investment into those technologies as well, as you know. So I think that it's not going to be simple, but I think that it sends a very strong message. And even last year, when the Australian government took over the presidency, I don't think they would have anticipated this would happen. So this is a game changer, and it's why G20 leaders will want to sit down and discuss climate change over the next couple of days, and it should be on the agenda.
Before we close, I do also want to make some comments about gender. As you watch all the leaders arrive, you may be struck by the profile of the leaders. It is the nature of politics, if you look around the globe, that still this meeting will be primarily a meeting of men of a particular profile. But we are here to talk about people. And I want to particularly acknowledge the women's leadership that has been throughout the work of the civil society and of women's leadership around the globe. I want to particularly thank those who have determinedly pursued gender equality as part of this agenda. I also want to say that we absolutely welcome the commitment to the employment target for women's participation, but with a cautionary note. The last thing we want to see is what has, for example, happened in the Australian context, where the agenda for lifting up women's economic participation in the labour market has been to cut income support, to cut supports with this notion that if you just make it harder, then women will find paid work. That isn't how it works. We need to be investing in women-led households. We need to be investing in the hope of young people, because as a globe we have a challenge about where paid work is, where the jobs are. This should be an optimistic agenda, one in which does not lead to a sense of more people being crushed as we come out the other side of this meeting, with an expectation of those who are already struggling have to struggle even harder in order to pursue economic growth. We absolutely welcome the focus on jobs, but it needs to be done through investment, not making it harder, particularly for those, the majority of people around the globe who experience poverty are women and their children. Thank you.
We need to draw to a close, I'm afraid, so thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.